John's hands tightened around the steering wheel as he navigated the winding roads of Beverly Hills. The area felt like a world apart from the modest streets he was accustomed to. Tall palm trees lined the pristine sidewalks, and every house he passed seemed more grand and opulent than the one before. His old pickup truck felt completely out of place among the shiny black SUVs and sleek sports cars parked along the curbs. He took a second glance at the address on his phone. Just one more. Regal Drive, he muttered, squinting at the numbers on the gates he passed. Then he spotted it. A massive wrought-iron gate with gold detailing and the unmistakable number 101 etched into a stone pillar. He let out a low whistle. Well, this must be it. Pulling up to the intercom, John pressed the button. A calm, almost robotic voice came through the speaker. State your name and purpose. John Miller, here to fix an electrical issue, he said, adjusting the strap of his tool belt. The gate creaked open slowly, revealing a long driveway lined with manicured hedges. At the end of it stood a mansion that looked like it belonged in a movie. A sprawling white building with towering columns, expansive windows, and a fountain at its center. Probably worth more than his entire house. Damn! John muttered under his breath as he parked next to the fountain. He grabbed his toolbox from the passenger seat and stepped out, feeling a mix of awe and discomfort. Before he could even knock, the front door opened. A middle-aged man in a sharp suit greeted him with a nod. Mr. Blake is expecting you. Please, follow me. John hesitated for a moment but then followed the man inside. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls adorned with artwork that could easily be in a museum. He felt out of place, his steel-toed boots echoing loudly against the polished floors. The man led him down a hallway to a study where Edward Blake, the homeowner, was waiting. Edward sat behind an enormous oak desk. His salt and pepper hair was neatly styled, and his tailored suit fit him perfectly. He glanced up from a document he was signing and offered John a polite but distant smile. You must be the electrician, Edward said, standing and extending a hand. His voice was smooth, the kind of tone someone uses when they're accustomed to being in control. John shook his hand, noticing the firm grip. Yeah, I'm here about the outlet issue in the West Wing. Edward nodded. Yes, it's been acting up. James will show you the way. As John followed James, his eyes wandered around the hallways, which were lined with framed photographs. He caught glimpses of a younger Edward with various celebrities and dignitaries. But as they turned a corner, something stopped him dead in his tracks. Tucked between larger, more prominent photos was a small black frame with a picture of a little boy, no older than 5 or 6, standing in a park. The boy had messy brown hair and a shy smile. But what really caught John's attention wasn't the setting or the boy's expression. It was the fact that the boy in the picture was him. John's stomach flipped. His first reaction was disbelief. He moved closer, squinting at the photo. There was no mistaking it, it was him. The same striped shirt, the same gap-toothed grin. He remembered that day clearly. His mom had taken him to the park for his birthday. Something wrong? James asked, his voice snapping John out of his daze. John turned slowly, gripping his toolbox tighter. That picture, he said, nodding toward the frame. Where did it come from? James followed his gaze, his face unreadable. You'll have to ask Mr. Blake about that. Without another word, John turned and marched back to the study, his heart pounding in his chest. Edward looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. You've got a picture of me on your wall, John said, his voice sharp. Why? Edward's expression shifted, a slight crack in his calm demeanor. I think you're mistaken. Mistaken, John repeated, a bitter laugh almost escaping his lips. I know my own face, Mr. Blake. That's me in that picture. So how the hell do you have it? Edward hesitated, his eyes briefly flicking to James, who quietly slipped out of the room, leaving them alone. The atmosphere grew thick with tension as Edward slowly walked to a cabinet near his desk. He opened a drawer, pulled out a folder, and set it on the desk. I was hoping to ease into this conversation, Edward said quietly. But I suppose there's no avoiding it now. John crossed his arms, waiting for an explanation. Edward gestured to the folder. Before I say anything, I need you to look at what's inside. John opened the folder, though reluctantly. Inside were several more photos of him as a child, along with handwritten notes and what looked like private investigator reports. His chest tightened as he flipped through the pages. Each one seemed to deepen the pit in his stomach. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Edward met his eyes, and for the first time, John saw something vulnerable in his expression. "John, there's a reason your picture is in my house," Edward said softly. "You're my son." John stood frozen, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air heavy with disbelief and tension. He wanted to laugh, to accuse Edward of lying, but the sincerity in his eyes made the words stick in his throat. "You've got to be kidding me," John finally muttered, slamming the folder shut. "Is this some kind of joke? Because if it is, it's not funny." Edward sighed deeply, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "I wish it were a joke, John. But it's the truth." John took a step back, shaking his head. "It's the truth," he echoed. "You don't get to drop something like that on me and call it the truth. You don't know anything about me." Edward's expression softened, though the lines of regret around his mouth deepened. "You're right," he admitted. "I don't know you, and that's my fault. But if you'll let me explain." "Explain what?" John interrupted, his voice rising. "How you decided to play family detective. How you somehow know more about my life than I do." Edward remained silent for a moment, watching John carefully. "You deserve answers," he said finally. "But you also deserve the full story. Will you sit down and let me tell you?" John hesitated, torn between his instincts to storm out and an unsettling curiosity that kept him rooted in place. Slowly, he sank into the leather chair across from Edward's desk. Edward followed suit, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. "It was over 25 years ago," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "I was young, arrogant, and honestly a coward. I met your mother, Mary, at a diner not far from my college," Edward continued. "She worked the morning shift to support herself while attending nursing school." John frowned. His mother had never mentioned anything about working at a diner. He opened his mouth to speak, then stopped himself, deciding to let Edward continue. "She was unlike anyone I'd ever met," Edward said, his eyes distant as though lost in the memory. "She was kind but strong, smart without being pretentious. We fell in love quickly. Too quickly, maybe." John crossed his arms, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The idea of his mother being involved with a man like this, someone so wealthy and living in a mansion, felt almost impossible to process. Edward hesitated, his voice faltering for a moment. "But my father didn't approve," he continued, his tone heavy. "He said Mary was beneath us, just a distraction. He threatened to disown me if I didn't end things. And you just listened to him?" John snapped, bitterness creeping into his voice. Edward nodded solemnly. "At the time, I thought I had no choice. I thought losing my inheritance would ruin my life. So I did what he wanted. I ended things with Mary." John's chest tightened at the thought of his young, vulnerable mother being cast aside for the sake of money. His anger flared. "And then what? You just walked away and forgot about her?" "No," Edward said quickly, shaking his head. "I never forgot her. I tried to find her again a year later, but by then, she was gone. I hired private investigators, but it was as if she had vanished." He stopped for a moment, his voice catching. "I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know about you." John stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane," he muttered, pacing the room. "Why now? Why dig all this up after all these years?" Edward stood as well, his expression earnest. "Because I finally found you. A few months ago, my investigator tracked down Mary. That's when I found out about you. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing, John. Not again." "Mary?" John repeated the name, the word feeling strange on his lips. She's known about this. She never said a word. Edward nodded. She probably thought she was protecting you. She knew what my father was capable of. She must have thought you were better off without me. John let out a bitter laugh, more out of frustration than amusement. Well, I'd say she got that right. Edward didn't respond. The silence hung in the air, thick with unsaid words. Finally, John grabbed the folder from the desk and turned toward the door. "Where are you going?" Edward asked, his voice edged with concern. "To get the truth," John replied without looking back. Later that evening, John pulled into his mother's driveway. The small, modest house where he'd grown up looked just as it always had, but tonight, it felt different, like a place that had been hiding secrets for years. Mary opened the door before he could even knock. Her gray-streaked hair was tied back, and a warm smile spread across her face when she saw him. "John, what a surprise," she said, her voice bright. John didn't return her smile. "We need to talk." Her expression shifted instantly, concern replacing the warmth. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside. Inside, John placed the folder on the kitchen table and opened it, letting the photos and papers spill out. Mary's eyes widened as she took in the contents. Her hand flew to her mouth in shock. "You've got some explaining to do," John said, his voice tight. "What is all this? And why didn't you ever tell me about him?" Mary sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping. "I was hoping this day would never come," she murmured. "Well, it's here," John replied, his tone hard. "Start talking." Mary sat quietly at the table, her hands trembling as she picked up one of the photos. Her eyes lingered on an image of John as a little boy, smiling brightly in the park. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. John noticed, his anger softening for a moment. "Mom," he said, his voice gentler despite his frustration. "Why didn't you ever tell me about him? About Edward Blake?" Mary let out a shaky sigh, setting the photo back on the table. "I never wanted to lie to you, John, but it wasn't that simple." "Not that simple?" John scoffed, pacing the small kitchen. "You knew who he was all this time. You knew he was out there, and you never said a word. Why?" Mary looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and defiance. "Because I didn't want you to grow up hating a man you'd never met. And I didn't want you to be hurt by someone who had already hurt me." John stopped pacing, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "Hurt you? How, Mom?" "He said he loved you. He said he wanted to find you." Mary let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Edward Blake loved his comfort and privilege more than anything else. The minute his father told him to end things, he didn't even fight for me." John felt a brief pang of sympathy for his mother, but it was quickly overtaken by his own confusion. "So that's it? He made a mistake, and you decided to keep me in the dark forever?" Mary's voice grew firm, a tone he rarely heard from her. "It wasn't just a mistake, John. It was a choice that left me alone, scared, and pregnant. I didn't know what he was capable of, and I wasn't about to risk your safety." John frowned, his mind racing. "What do you mean by what he was capable of? Are you talking about him or his father?" Mary hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "His father was a cruel man, John. Controlling, manipulative. When Edward and I were together, he made it clear I wasn't welcome in their world. And when I refused to walk away, he made it even clearer that he would do whatever it took to keep Edward away from me." John stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. "What did he do?" Mary's eyes dropped to the table, her voice barely audible. "He said he would ruin my life, destroy any chance I had of finishing my education, of ever getting a job. And when I refused to back down, he had me followed. He made sure I knew that I was constantly being watched, just waiting for me to slip up. It was terrifying." John felt his stomach twist at the thought of his young mother facing that kind of pressure alone. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why not go to the police?" he asked, struggling to understand. "Who would have believed me?" Mary responded bitterly. "He was Edward Blake Sr., one of the most powerful men in the state. and I was just a waitress trying to survive. John sat down opposite her, the anger in his chest shifting to something more complicated, harder to grasp. So you ran, he said quietly. You disappeared. Mary nodded. I didn't have any other choice. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew I had to protect you. I couldn't risk him finding us. I couldn't lose you. John rubbed his temples, trying to process her words. And Edward, he really didn't know? He says he tried to find you. Mary's expression softened just a little. Maybe he did. But by the time he tried, I was long gone. And to be honest, John, I didn't want to be found. A heavy silence settled between them, each word hanging in the air, thick with history and unspoken truths. Finally, John broke the stillness. He says he wants to make things right, John said, his voice laced with doubt. He says he wants to get to know me. Mary locked eyes with him. And what do you want, John? John hesitated. The question weighed on him more than he expected. Part of him wanted to reject everything about Edward, the wealth, the mansion, the complication of it all. But another part of him, quieter and more insistent, felt an undeniable pull, the need to understand this man who was supposed to be his father. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know if I can trust him. Mary reached out, placing her hand over his. I understand. But remember this, whatever you decide, you don't owe him anything. Not your forgiveness, not your time. That's yours to decide. John nodded, though the knot in his chest didn't loosen. What if he's telling the truth? What if he really didn't know about me? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary sighed, her shoulders slumping. Then that's for him to prove, isn't it? John stayed for a while longer, the conversation veering to lighter topics, but the tension never fully left. As he drove home, his thoughts were clouded with questions. Edward's words replayed in his mind, and he struggled to discern whether there had been truth in them, or if it was all just a desperate attempt to rewrite history. For the first time, John felt like he was a puzzle with pieces missing. Pieces he wasn't sure he wanted to find. Or maybe he did. He wasn't sure anymore. The next day, he found himself parked in front of Edward's mansion again. Staring at the massive gates, he felt the familiar pull between wanting to walk away and needing answers. Part of him still wanted to forget it all, pretend the photo had never existed, that the conversation with Edward had never happened. But the other part of him, the part that couldn't ignore the questions, was stronger. With a sigh, he pressed the intercom. The gate creaked open, and he slowly drove up the driveway, parking near the fountain. This time, James was already at the door waiting for him. Mr. Blake is expecting you, James said, his voice as even as always. John followed him into the house, but instead of the study, James led him to a sitting room. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a stunning view of the gardens. Edward stood by a bookshelf, flipping through a weathered photo album. He looked up as John entered, a flicker of relief crossing his face. John, Edward said, closing the album and placing it on a table. I wasn't sure you'd come back. Neither was I, John admitted, leaning against the doorframe. But here I am. You wanted to explain more, so go ahead. Edward motioned to a chair, but John remained where he was, unwilling to sit just yet. Edward seemed to understand his reluctance and sat down himself, the silence between them thick with anticipation. I want to start by thanking you for giving me another chance to talk, Edward said, his voice serious. I know this isn't easy for you. I don't take that lightly. Just get to the point, John said, his tone sharp as he crossed his arms. Edward exhaled slowly. I've told you about my father and how he forced me to end things with your mother. But I haven't told you the full extent of what he did to make sure I never found her again. John frowned. What do you mean? When I tried to reach out to Mary a year after we broke up, she was gone, Edward said. At first, I thought she had just moved on, maybe started a new life. But something didn't sit right. She had vanished without a trace. No forwarding address, no contact with anyone we knew. John's jaw tightened. Yeah, because your father made sure of it. Edward nodded. I didn't know that at the time. I blamed myself for not trying harder, for not standing up to him when I had the chance. I hired a private investigator, but every lead turned into a dead end. He paused, his gaze turning distant. Years later, after my father passed away, I found out the extent of what he'd done. He'd been intercepting all of my attempts to contact Mary. Letters, phone calls, none of it ever reached her. He even paid off private investigators to give me false reports. John's stomach churned. He had known Edward's father was a manipulative man, but hearing how deeply he had interfered made his blood boil. So he just erased her from your life? John asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Exactly, Edward replied, his voice tight with regret. And I let him. I didn't fight hard enough. And because of that, I lost both of you. John looked away, his mind spinning with the weight of Edward's words. He wanted to hate Edward for his weakness, but the pain in the man's voice made it difficult. Why tell me all of this now? John asked. What difference does it make? Because I need you to know the truth, Edward said earnestly. Not just about the past, but about what I'm trying to do now. Finding you wasn't just about reconnecting. It's about making things right. Owning up to my mistakes and proving to you that I'm not the man my father was. John let out a bitter laugh. And how exactly are you planning on doing that? Throwing money at me? Writing me into your will? Edward shook his head. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, and I'm not trying to buy your forgiveness. I just want a chance to get to know you, to be a part of your life. If you'll let me. The sincerity in Edward's voice caught John off guard. He had expected arrogance, entitlement, but instead, he saw a man burdened with regret, trying to claw his way back from years of mistakes. Before John could respond, the door opened, and James stepped inside, his expression unusually tense. Sir, there's someone here to see you. Edward's face immediately soured. Who? James hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. It's Mrs. Collins. John watched as Edward's expression darkened even further. Tell her I'm not available. I already did, sir, James replied carefully. But she insisted. Who is Mrs. Collins? John asked, his curiosity piqued. Edward's jaw tightened, and for the first time since meeting him, he looked genuinely unsettled. She's someone who complicates things. Before John could ask more, a sharp, commanding voice rang out from the hallway. Edward, don't tell me you're hiding from me now. A tall, striking woman walked into the room moments later. She was impeccably styled, with sharp, aristocratic features and perfectly styled blonde hair. Her smile, however, was cold, her eyes distant. She glanced at John, then turned her attention back to Edward. Well, she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. Is this the famous long-lost son I've heard so much about? John felt a chill run through him. He didn't know who this woman was, but the way she sized him up, like a specimen she was debating whether to squash, sent a shiver down his spine. Edward rose from his seat, his posture tense. What do you want, Linda? Her smile widened, though her eyes remained frigid. Oh, nothing much. Just thought I'd see what all the fuss is about. She looked back at John, tilting her head slightly, as if examining him like a piece of art. You certainly don't look like someone who belongs in a place like this. John bristled, but kept his mouth shut, sensing that this woman was far more dangerous than she appeared. Edward, however, was losing patience. You've said enough, he said firmly. Now leave. Linda laughed softly, a low, menacing sound. Edward, you should know by now. I never leave without getting what I want. John leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. The air between Edward and Linda felt thick with tension, like something was about to snap. Edward was like a wall, standing rigid, his face carved in anger. But John could sense something else there too, something almost like fear. Linda, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, her sharp eyes cutting between the two men like she was deciding how to deal with prey. Who the hell is she? John finally blurted, unable to stay silent any longer. Linda's lips curled into a knowing smile. Oh, Edward, you didn't tell him about me? She walked toward a nearby armchair and sat down as if she owned the entire room. How disappointing. After all, I am deeply involved in your little family history. Edward's voice grew cold and measured. Linda, this isn't the time or place. Leave. But Linda didn't even acknowledge him. Instead, her eyes were locked on John. I suppose introductions are in order then, she said with exaggerated politeness. Linda Collins. I was married to Edward's father, which I guess makes me your step-grandmother. Charming, isn't it? John blinked, his mind reeling. You were married to his father? That's right, Linda replied casually. She adjusted her position in the armchair, as if she were settling into a comfortable conversation. And let's just say I was around for all the drama your mother caused. Edward's voice cut through sharply. That's enough, Linda. You don't get to rewrite history. Linda chuckled, unfazed. Oh, Edward. Always so defensive. She turned her gaze back to John. The truth is, your existence was a little inconvenient. A secret we both worked hard to keep hidden. Your mother and I made sure things stayed orderly. John's stomach twisted in disgust. What the hell is she talking about? Edward exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. She's talking about the lengths my father went to separate me from your mother. And now, apparently, she's claiming some of the credit. Not credit, Linda corrected, smirking. Responsibility. After all, your father and I were a team. It was my idea to send the investigator after Mary. Someone had to keep the family's reputation intact. John's jaw clenched with fury. You followed my mom. You threatened her. Linda waved her hand dismissively. I wouldn't call it threatening. More like encouraging her to move on. John jumped to his feet, fists clenched, the anger burning through him. You ruined her life. You ruined both of our lives. Linda tilted her head, unbothered. Oh, don't be so dramatic. She managed just fine, didn't she? And look at you, hard-working salt of the earth, just like she wanted. Edward stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. You crossed a line, Linda. You and my father both. But this ends now. Linda raised an eyebrow, the amusement fading from her expression. Oh, Edward, always so righteous. But let's not forget you let it happen. You walked away. Don't pin all of this on me. Edward flinched, and John felt his own anger flare again. Don't listen to her, John said sharply. She's just trying to shift the blame. Linda stood, her composure snapping back into place as she smoothed down her dress. Believe what you want, she said, brushing invisible lint off her sleeve. But if you think you're entitled to anything from this family, you're sorely mistaken. John frowned, confused and angered. What the hell are you talking about? Linda's smile returned, razor sharp. Let's just say there are some people who stand to lose a lot if you suddenly become a part of Edward's world. And I wouldn't count on everyone being as welcoming as dear old daddy here. Edward stepped in front of John, his voice commanding. Enough, Linda. Get out. Linda shrugged nonchalantly, as if she hadn't just made an ominous threat. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. With that, she turned and strode out, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. The sound of her departure echoed through the room, but the tension she left behind lingered like a storm cloud. John let out a shaky breath, still standing with his fists clenched. Who the hell is she, really? And why do I feel like this isn't over? Edward sighed, sinking onto the couch, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Linda is dangerous, he said quietly. She's always cared more about power and money than anything else. When she married my father, she saw herself as the gatekeeper of our family's legacy. She'll do whatever it takes to keep control. John's eyes narrowed. And you let her get away with it? He said, his tone accusatory. Edward's gaze met his, filled with regret. I didn't have a choice. My father gave her free rein, and by the time I realized how deep her claws were, it was too late. She knew every secret, every weakness, and she used them all. John paced back and forth, the frustration simmering just below the surface. So now what? She just admitted to stalking my mom, and she's clearly not done with us. Are we supposed to just wait for her to make her next move? Edward's jaw tightened. No, we're not. I'm not letting her or anyone else come between us again. His voice was firm, and for the first time, John noticed a rare conviction in his words. He glimpsed the man who might have fought for Mary all those years ago. John paused, his voice quieter. If circumstances had been different, then what do we do now? Edward placed a hand on John's shoulder, his gaze steady. We start by digging into the past. If Linda wants to play games, then we'll be ready. The next morning, John stood in the kitchen of his modest home, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The weight of the past few days hung heavily on him. His life had been simple, predictable until now. It felt like someone had opened a door to a past he hadn't known existed. One filled with lies, betrayal, and secrets. His phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting his thoughts. The screen flashed with Edward's name. John hesitated, his mind racing, before answering, his voice sharper than he intended. What is it? John. Edward's voice came through steady but tinged with urgency. I need to talk to you. Can you come by the house? John rubbed his temples. What now? More family drama. It's about Linda, Edward replied. I've been looking into some things, and there's something you need to see. John sighed, frustration building. As much as he wanted to distance himself from this tangled mess, he couldn't ignore the growing need to understand the man who claimed to be his father. Fine. I'll be there in an hour. When John arrived at the mansion, Edward greeted him at the door. He looked more disheveled than usual, his normally sharp suit slightly wrinkled, a shadow of stubble on his chin. Rough night? John asked, stepping inside. You could say that, Edward muttered, leading him to the study. The room smelled faintly of whiskey, and an empty glass sat on the desk next to a stack of old papers. Edward gestured for John to sit, but John remained standing, crossing his arms. Just get to the point. Edward nodded, his expression grim. I've been going through some of my father's old records, financial documents, personal correspondence, things I hadn't thought to look at before, and I found something disturbing. He slid a folder across the desk toward John. Take a look. John opened the folder reluctantly. Inside were typed letters and financial statements, many signed by Edward's father. But one document stood out, a transfer of funds to a private investigator, dated just a few weeks before Mary disappeared. This is from the guy who followed my mom, John murmured, his voice low. Edward nodded. Yes, confirms what Linda said. She and my father hired someone to track Mary down and pressure her to leave. But there's more. He pulled another piece of paper from the stack and handed it to John. It was a handwritten letter, the ink smudged in places, but still legible. The signature at the bottom read, Linda Collins Blake. John scanned the letter, his stomach sinking with each word. It detailed a conversation between Linda and the investigator about keeping Mary's whereabouts a secret. Not just from Edward, but from anyone who might start asking questions. The last line hit him like a punch to the gut. Ensure she disappears for good. No loose ends. John dropped the paper onto the desk. She wanted my mom gone permanently. Edward leaned forward, clasping his hands together. It looks that way, but I don't think my father fully knew what she was doing. He might have been ruthless, but he wouldn't have gone that far. John scoffed, bitter laughter escaping him. And that's supposed to make it better? He let her run the show, didn't he? Edward didn't respond immediately. He poured himself a glass of water and took a slow sip before speaking. You're right. He let her get away with too much. And now we're left to deal with the consequences. John's mind raced as he paced the room. So what now? We know she's behind this. But what are we supposed to do about it? Edward set the glass down, his jaw tightening. We gather more evidence. Linda isn't just a threat to us. She's a threat to everyone connected to this family. If we can prove what she's done, we can stop her. John stopped pacing and faced Edward. You make it sound so simple. She's got money, connections, and she's not afraid to use them. Edward met his gaze, his expression resolute. That's why we have to be smart and careful. If we move too soon, she'll destroy whatever evidence we have. John shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. This is insane. I came here to fix a damn outlet, and now I'm stuck in some soap opera with a crazy step-grandmother and a father I didn't even know I had. Edward's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. Life has a way of throwing curveballs, doesn't it? John didn't laugh. Instead, he grabbed the folder and tucked it under his arm. I'll help you dig into this, but I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for my mom. Edward nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. Fair enough. Thank you, John. As John left the mansion, his thoughts were a whirlwind. He didn't trust Edward completely, but the sincerity in his eyes when he handed over the evidence had felt real. For now, that was enough to keep him in the fight. Back at his house, John spread the documents across his kitchen table, poring over every detail. The more he read, the angrier he became. Not only had Linda manipulated Edward and his father, but she had actively destroyed lives to maintain control over the Blake fortune. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. A text from Edward. Be careful. Linda won't go down without a fight. John stared at the message, a chill running down his spine. He didn't need the warning. He already knew Linda was dangerous. The real question was whether he was ready to face whatever came next. The papers sprawled across the table felt heavier than just ink on paper. Each word, each signature, painted a clearer picture of the lengths Linda Collins had gone to protect her position. The deeper John dug, the more disgusted he became. She wasn't just manipulative. She was a real threat. He flipped through the letters, his eyes landing on another handwritten note. This one wasn't signed by Linda, but by Edward's father. It referred to a significant transfer of funds marked as discretionary services. The date made John pause. 2 months before Edward Sr.'s death. Discretionary services, he muttered to himself. What the hell does that mean? He snapped a picture of the letter, feeling a gut instinct telling him it wasn't a coincidence. He needed Edward's take on it. As he began to organize the papers back into the folder, a loud knock at the door startled him. Who's there? He called out, his voice sharp. Just open the door, Miller, came a familiar voice. John frowned as he opened the door to find James, Edward's loyal assistant, standing there with a folder in hand. He looked as composed as ever. There was something different in James' expression when he walked into the room, an urgency that was completely unlike the usually composed man. James, John said, stepping aside to let him in. What's going on? James walked in and glanced around before lowering his voice. Mr. Blake asked me to bring this to you. He thinks it will help you understand what's really at stake. John took the folder, his frown deepening. What's in it? Details about Linda's past dealings, James said, his tone low. But it's not just about her. There are connections that go beyond the Blake family. John flipped open the folder and started scanning the papers inside. It was filled with financial documents, legal files, and what looked like surveillance photos of Linda meeting with various people. One name immediately caught his eye, Donovan Security Services. John's stomach turned. This name keeps coming up, he muttered, pointing to the company. What do they have to do with all this? James hesitated for a moment, his face serious. They're a private firm, but one with a reputation for operating in the shadows. They were hired by Mr. Blake Sr. for, let's say, sensitive matters. John narrowed his eyes. And by sensitive, you mean illegal? James gave a slight nod. Possibly. There's evidence suggesting they were involved in activities ranging from intimidation to worse. John's pulse quickened. Are you saying they might have had something to do with your father's death? James straightened up, his expression becoming more neutral. I'm saying it's a possibility worth looking into. Later that evening, John sat in his truck outside Edward's mansion, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The folder James had given him rested on the passenger seat, and his mind was racing with questions. He wasn't sure if he was ready to confront whatever truth awaited him, but deep down, he knew there was no turning back now. Taking a deep breath, John grabbed the folder and headed toward the door. James let him in without a word, leading him straight to the study where Edward sat, looking more worn down than usual. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes tired. "You found something," Edward said, his statement more a fact than a question. "Yeah," John replied, dropping the folder onto the desk. "And I'm guessing you already know what it is." Edward opened the folder, skimming through the documents. His jaw tightened as he read, his silence speaking volumes. Finally, John pressed, "Are you going to tell me what Donovan Security Services really is?" Edward closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "They're trouble," he said simply. "My father used them for years to handle certain issues. Linda continued using them after his death." John's hands clenched into fists. "Issues like threatening my mom?" Edward nodded, though reluctantly. "Among other things." John's voice rose in anger. "And now what? You think they had something to do with your father's death?" Edward hesitated, his gaze fixed on the folder. "I don't know, but if they did, Linda would be the one to know. She had access to everything, his accounts, his contacts. If there's a connection, it's through her." John shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "This is insane. She's not just some bitter ex. She's dangerous. And if we're right, she's not going to stop until she takes everything." Edward stood, his expression hardening. "Which is why we can't let her win." That night, John returned home with a plan slowly forming in his mind. He knew Linda wouldn't go down without a fight. He wasn't naive enough to think this would end peacefully. But for the first time, he felt like he and Edward were finally on the same side. At his kitchen table, John flipped through the documents again. The name, Donovan Security Services, jumped out at him. A stark reminder of just how deep the situation went. His phone rang, and without hesitation, he picked up. "We need to move fast," John said as soon as Edward answered. "If Linda catches wind of what we're doing, she'll destroy any evidence we have." Edward's voice was firm. "Agreed. I'll have James start digging into Donovan's records. In the meantime, stay alert. Linda won't sit idle." John hung up, his resolve hardening. Whatever it took, he was determined to get to the bottom of this. Linda Collins had messed with the wrong family. The morning air was cool as John parked his truck outside a small diner on the outskirts of Beverly Hills. Edward had suggested they meet somewhere discreet, away from Linda or anyone in her circle. John wasn't sure how much of a difference it would make, but he wasn't about to take any chances. Edward was already seated in a corner booth when John walked in. He looked out of place in his expensive suit amidst the greasy counters and chipped coffee mugs, but he didn't seem to care. He was focused on a stack of papers in front of him, brow furrowed in concentration. "You look like you didn't sleep," John remarked as he slid into the booth across from Edward. Edward glanced up briefly, offering a faint smile. "I didn't. I've been going through everything James and I could dig up on Donovan Security Services. It's worse than I thought." John picked up one of the papers, scanning through the dense paragraphs. "Worse? How?" "They're not just a private security firm," Edward explained quietly. "They specialize in blackmail, cover-ups, and in some cases, eliminating threats." John's stomach lurched. "And you think Linda hired them to get rid of your dad?" Edward nodded grimly. "The timeline fits. My father had started pulling away from her just before his death. She knew her position was at risk. Hiring Donovan would have been a way to secure her control over the family fortune." John exhaled slowly, struggling to process the weight of Edward's words. "So what do we do now?" Edward leaned forward, his voice firm. "We need proof. Something that ties Linda directly to Donovan's operations." John frowned. "And how exactly are we supposed to get that? She's not just going to hand over a confession." Edward smirked faintly. "No, but she's made mistakes before. James found a connection, an old accountant who handled some of her private accounts. If we can convince him to talk, we might have what we need." Later that afternoon, John found himself sitting in a cramped office in a strip mall, facing a man who looked like he hadn't left his desk in weeks. The accountant, a wiry man named Victor, nervously adjusted his glasses, shifting in his chair. I don't know what you want me to say, Victor stammered, glancing back at the door like he might bolt at any moment. I don't work for her anymore. But you did, Edward said, his voice calm but insistent. And you know how she operates. We're not asking for much, Victor. Just enough to connect her to Donovan. Victor swallowed hard, his eyes darting around. You don't understand. She's not someone you cross. Neither was my father, Edward countered, his voice growing harder. And look where that got him. Victor froze, his eyes widening slightly. You think she had something to do with that? We don't think we know, Victor, John said, his voice cold and steady as he leaned closer, his gaze unwavering. The only question now is whether you'll help us prove it. Victor hesitated, his hands trembling as they drummed lightly on the desk. After a long pause, he let out a ragged sigh. There's a storage unit, he muttered, eyes shifting nervously. She kept records there, files, contracts. I was the one who handled the payments for it. Until a few years ago. John leaned in, his interest piqued. If those documents are still there, they might have what we need? Victor nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. They might. Edward's eyes sharpened. Where is it? Victor quickly scribbled an address on a scrap of paper and pushed it across the desk. But before they could take it, his voice dropped again, more urgent. But listen, he warned. If she catches wind of this, if she knows you've been there. He trailed off, a grim look crossing his face. You don't want to get on her bad side. That evening, John and Edward stood outside a nondescript storage facility tucked away on the edge of the city. The weight of what they were about to do settled heavily on John's chest. You sure about this? John asked, glancing sideways at Edward. No, Edward admitted quietly. But there's no other choice now. John nodded, taking a steadying breath as Edward unlocked the door. The inside of the unit was dim and filled with boxes, filing cabinets, and various storage bins. The room felt oddly ordinary at first, but John could sense the significance of what they were about to uncover. They began sifting through the files, scanning documents and setting aside anything that could be useful. Hours passed, and John's hope of finding anything substantial began to fade when Edward froze, his face suddenly draining of color. John. Edward's voice was tight as he held up a folder. Come take a look. John moved over quickly, his heart beginning to race. Edward handed him the folder, and John's eyes widened as he flipped through the papers. Inside were contracts signed by Linda and Donovan Security Services, detailing hefty payments for specialized services around the time of Edward Sr.'s death. But it wasn't just the contracts that sent a cold shiver down John's spine. At the bottom of one page was a handwritten note with only a few words. Ensure the target is neutralized. No loose ends. John could barely breathe as he read the words. This is it, he said softly, almost too quietly to hear. This is exactly what we need. Edward's jaw tightened. But now comes the hard part. Linda won't go down without a fight. As they made their way out of the storage unit, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced behind him, scanning the shadows of the empty parking lot. It was still eerily quiet, but the hairs on his neck prickled. You all right? Edward asked, noticing John's wariness. Yeah, John muttered, though he didn't feel okay. Let's just get out of here. Driving away, John couldn't stop thinking about Linda, how she would react once she realized what they had on her. One thing was for sure. They were in deeper than they'd ever intended, and this was only the beginning. The next morning, John sat at his kitchen table, staring at the folder they had found. The papers before him laid out everything. Proof that Linda had been behind Edward Sr.'s death, with the involvement of Donovan Security Services to cover it up. The reality of what they had discovered weighed on him like an anchor, and he felt the pressure of it all crashing in. His phone buzzed on the counter, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Edward. Did you sleep? Edward asked when John answered, his tone surprisingly tired. John let out a dry laugh. Does it look like I did? I'm right there with you, Edward sighed. We have what we need, but now comes the real challenge. making sure this doesn't backfire. John glanced at the folder, frustration bubbling up. What's the plan? We can't just walk into a police station with this without tipping Linda off. I know, Edward replied, his voice firm. That's why I've reached out to someone who can help. An old friend in law enforcement. He's agreed to meet us this afternoon. You trust him? John asked, skepticism lacing his words. As much as I trust anyone in this situation, Edward answered. He's not involved with Linda, and he's helped me in the past. If anyone can bring her down, it's him. John hesitated before nodding. All right, let's do this. By the afternoon, John and Edward were seated in a cramped, windowless office in a downtown building, facing Detective Mark Collins. A man in his late 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He scanned the folder for a few moments before looking up. So, Mark said, his voice even, you're telling me Linda Collins was behind Edward Sr.'s death, and that Donovan Security Services covered it up? Exactly, Edward replied, his voice unwavering. Mark let out a low whistle. I've heard rumors about Donovan, but nothing this solid. If this holds up, it could be bigger than just Linda. A lot bigger. John frowned. What do you mean by bigger? Mark tapped the folder. If Donovan's behind this, it could connect to other unsolved cases. They don't operate alone. Taking them down could unravel an entire network of corruption. John exchanged a glance with Edward, realizing just how much more was at stake now. This wasn't just about Linda anymore. It was about something far larger and far more dangerous. What do we need to do? Edward asked, his tone now even more serious. Mark's expression turned grim. We need to be careful. If Linda catches wind of this before we're ready, she'll burn everything you've got and disappear. Worse, she might come after you too. John's heart dropped. So what's the plan? I'll start cross-checking these documents, Mark replied. It'll take a few days, but I'll look for anything that ties Linda to Donovan and see if I can link her to other criminal activity. In the meantime, you two need to keep a low profile. Don't give her any reason to suspect you're onto her. Edward nodded, but John's stomach churned at the thought of Linda on the hunt. He wasn't naive. She wasn't going to sit still while they gathered evidence. That evening, John found himself trying to distract himself with a leaky faucet in the bathroom, but his mind kept wandering back to the folder. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that Linda was already ahead of them. His phone buzzed on the counter again. It was a text from Edward. Stay alert. I got a bad feeling about this. Before John could reply, a faint sound caught his attention. The crunch of gravel underfoot. His pulse spiked as he grabbed a wrench from the counter and crept toward the window, peering into the night. At first, he saw nothing. But then, just at the edge of his property, a shadow shifted. Who's out there? He called, stepping out onto the porch. The shadow froze, then swiftly melted back into the darkness. John's heart pounded as he scanned the yard. Whoever it was had vanished, gone without a trace. The next morning, John and Edward met at a quiet park, away from any eyes. Edward looked just as worn as John felt, his face etched with the same exhaustion. Something's off, John said, his voice low. Last night, I swear someone was watching my house. Edward frowned, his face tightening with concern. Did you see who it was? No, John admitted, his eyes scanning the darkening streets. But I know it's her people. She knows something's up. Edward cursed quietly under his breath. If Linda's onto us, we need to act fast. Mark said he needed a few days, but we might not have that long. John nodded, his mind racing. So what do we do now? Edward's gaze hardened. We make her move first. We push her. Force her into making a mistake. John raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do we do that? Edward hesitated for a moment, his hand pulling out his phone. We let her know we're not afraid of her. If she's watching, we'll use that against her. I'll arrange a meeting with her. She won't be able to resist. John's stomach churned at the thought of confronting Linda directly. But he knew Edward was right. If they waited any longer, she'd make the first move. All right, John said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Let's do it." That evening, Edward sent Linda a message through one of her known associates, arranging a meeting at a high-end restaurant downtown. The bait was simple enough. Edward claimed to have information that would be valuable to her, something that could change the Blake family's future. John watched as Edward sent the message, his own tension building. "You sure about this?" John asked, his voice tight. "No," Edward admitted with a sigh, pressing send. "But it's our best shot now." With the trap set, they were left to wait. The minutes ticked by slowly, the tension in the air growing thick. A sleek black car pulled up to the valet outside Millionaire, one of Beverly Hills' most exclusive restaurants. Linda stepped out, her movements calculated, her posture perfect. She adjusted the cuff of her tailored jacket and surveyed the entrance with a knowing smile. Inside, Edward was already seated at a corner table. He looked calm, his face impassive, but John could see the subtle tension in his shoulders. John sat across from him, fiddling nervously with his napkin. The restaurant buzzed softly with quiet conversations, the clinking of glasses and silverware serving as an elegant backdrop to what John knew was about to become anything but civil. "She's here," Edward murmured, his eyes flicking toward the door. John followed his gaze, and his heart thudded in his chest. Linda walked toward them, her presence magnetic. Every inch the untouchable socialite. But John knew better now. Behind that poised exterior was a woman capable of far more than anyone gave her credit for. "Edward," Linda said smoothly as she reached the table, her gaze flicking briefly to John before widening in mock surprise. "And the prodigal son? How quaint." Edward motioned for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "Linda." She slid into the chair, crossing her legs with practiced grace. "I must admit," she began, "I was intrigued by your message. Something I'd find valuable? I can't imagine what you think you have that I don't already know." Edward didn't blink. "I think you'll find it's more than you expect." John leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You know exactly what you did, Linda, and we have the proof." Linda tilted her head, a bemused smile curling her lips. "Proof?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Proof of what exactly?" "Don't play games," Edward said coldly, his tone cutting. "We know about Donovan. We know about the payments, the orders, the storage unit. We know you had my father killed." For a split second, a flicker of something crossed Linda's face. Was it anger? Discomfort? But it was gone before it could settle, replaced by that same practiced smile. "Such bold accusations," she said, her voice almost pitying. "Really, Edward, this is beneath you. Digging through old files, dragging this poor boy into your delusions." John's fists clenched under the table, his patience wearing thin. "Don't talk about me like I'm not here." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. After all, you're the one who stands to gain the most from all this drama. An inheritance, a place in the Blake family legacy. It must be quite the dream come true." John stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. "You think this is about money? You think I want anything from you?" "Sit down, John," Edward said quietly, his voice low but firm. Linda smiled, unfazed. "Edward, let's not turn this into a spectacle. If you really had proof, you wouldn't be sitting here. You'd be handing it over to the authorities. But instead, you're here trying to rattle me. It's almost endearing." Edward leaned forward, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "You're right. If I had all the proof, I wouldn't be here. But I have enough to destroy you, Linda. And if you think I won't use it, you don't know me as well as you think." Linda's smile faltered just slightly, but she didn't waver. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him. "You're bluffing." Edward reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small USB drive on the table. The silence between them was deafening. "Am I?" Edward said, his eyes locking onto hers. Linda's gaze fixed on the drive, but her expression remained unreadable. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away as the tension between them grew. "You don't have the stomach for this, Edward," Linda finally said, her voice quieter now, though still sharp. "You never did. That's why I had to clean up after you and your father for years. Do you think anyone will believe you now? Do you think you can outmaneuver me? John couldn't hold it back any longer. You're done, Linda, he said, his voice firm, unwavering. You can't cover this up. Not this time. Linda's icy stare shot to him, her eyes cold and calculating. Careful, boy, she warned. You don't know who you're dealing with. Edward stood, towering over her. You're the one who should be careful. Walk away now, Linda. Leave it all behind and disappear. It's the only chance you have left. Linda rose slowly, her composure cracking just slightly. You're making a mistake, Edward, she said, turning her gaze toward John. And you? You should remember that the Blakes chew up and spit out people like you. She turned on her heel, striding out of the restaurant, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Edward exhaled deeply, sitting back down. You think that worked? John asked, his voice low. Edward shook his head.
No.
But she knows we're serious now. She'll make a move soon, and when she does, we'll be ready. As Linda left the restaurant, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number with practiced precision. We have a problem, she said, her voice tight. Handle it. The night felt heavier than usual, the air thick with the sense that danger was closing in. John paced in the living room of his small home, phone clenched in his hand. A few minutes earlier, Edward had called, his voice unusually tense. She's not backing down, Edward had said. And I don't think she's acting alone anymore. Be careful. The warning echoed in John's mind like a mantra. Linda was cornered now, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. A sudden knock at the door startled him. He grabbed a wrench from the counter, making it a makeshift weapon as he approached cautiously. Who is it? He called out, his voice tight. It's James, came the familiar voice, calm but strained. John opened the door to find James standing there, his usual stoic demeanor cracking just slightly. We need to move quickly, James said, stepping inside. Edward believes Linda has hired someone to retrieve the evidence. She knows we have enough to bury her. John's stomach churned. So what do we do? Sit here and wait for her to come after us? No, James said, shaking his head. Edward has arranged a secure location for you. He wants you to leave now. John hesitated, glancing back at the folder on the kitchen table. I'm not running. Not now. James stepped closer, his voice firm. This isn't running. It's buying time. Linda won't go down without a fight. And if she comes after you, it won't just be a scare tactic. John clenched his jaw, then nodded reluctantly. Fine. Let's go. John couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was about to go terribly wrong. The city lights streaked by outside the window, but his attention was fixed on the folder resting in his lap, the very evidence they had risked so much to obtain. Without warning, James jerked the car to the side, taking a sharp turn into a narrow street. Hold on, he said, his voice tense. What the hell are you doing? John demanded, gripping the dashboard as if his life depended on it. We're being followed, James replied, glancing quickly into the rearview mirror. That black SUV's been tailing us since we left your place. John turned in his seat, catching sight of the vehicle in question. His heart began to race. It's probably Linda's people, James said, his tone unervingly calm, despite the situation. Hold on tight. James navigated the streets with skill, making sharp turns and darting through alleys in a desperate attempt to lose the tail. But the SUV stayed right behind them, its headlights unwavering in the rearview mirror. This isn't working, John said, his voice rising with frustration. Trust me, James said, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the steering wheel. They approached an intersection, and without a second thought, James slammed on the brakes. The SUV behind them swerved to avoid crashing into them. James immediately floored the gas pedal, making a sharp left turn. The SUV hesitated for a moment before speeding past the intersection, vanishing into the distance. Is it gone? John asked, his heart still pounding in his chest. For now, James answered, pulling the car to the side of the road. But we need to move quickly. When they arrived at the safe house, a modest cabin tucked away on the outskirts of the city, Edward was already waiting on the porch. His face was pale but resolute. "Did they follow you?" he asked as they approached. "Not anymore," James replied. "But they're getting bolder." Edward nodded solemnly. "It's only a matter of time before they make another move." John handed Edward the folder. "This is what they want. If it's this important, why not take it to the police now?" Edward shook his head, his expression serious. "We need to play this carefully. Mark is still building the case, and if Linda suspects we've already handed it over, she'll vanish before we have a chance to stop her." "So, what's the plan?" John asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Edward locked eyes with him, his expression hardening. "We make her come to us." That night, Edward sent Linda a message designed to lure her into a trap. He told her he had more evidence stored at the cabin and suggested they meet to discuss a potential deal. John was doubtful, but Edward insisted it was their best shot at exposing her. The hours dragged on in tense silence, the weight of the waiting pressing heavily on John. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of wind outside, seemed to fray his nerves even more. Finally, headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the dirt road leading to the cabin. "She's here," Edward said, standing by the window. John grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of the room, his grip tight around the handle. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Edward nodded. "Stay out of sight. Let me handle her." Moments later, Linda entered the cabin, flanked by two men in dark suits. Her eyes immediately fixed on Edward, her expression cold and calculating. "Edward," she said, her voice dripping with mock politeness. "I must admit, you're braver than I thought." Edward remained calm, his voice steady. "I'm not here to play games, Linda. This ends tonight." Linda scanned the room, her gaze lingering on the folder on the table. "And you think this little stunt will stop me?" she sneered. "I don't think," Edward replied, his voice unwavering. "I know." At that moment, the front door crashed open, and Detective Mark Collins entered, flanked by a team of officers. "You're under arrest," Mark declared firmly. Linda's composure shattered as the officers closed in on her. "You'll regret this, Edward," she hissed. "You're destroying your own family." "No," Edward said coldly. "I'm saving it." As Linda was led away in handcuffs, John felt a wave of relief wash over him. The immediate danger wasn't gone, but the woman who had haunted their lives for years was finally facing consequences. Edward turned to John, his face a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "You were right to keep fighting, John." "Thank you." John nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for my mom, for the life she deserved." Edward placed a hand on John's shoulder. "Then let's make sure her sacrifices weren't in vain." In the weeks that followed, Linda's arrest rocked the Blake family and beyond. Donovan's security services was exposed, unraveling a web of corruption that reached far deeper than anyone had imagined. For John, life began to return to some semblance of normal. His relationship with Edward was far from perfect, but it was a start, a fragile connection forged from shared pain and the hope for something better. One evening, as he stood on the porch of his home watching the sun dip below the horizon, John allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.